some of this kind of fits in, and I wonder that concept of how Americans perceive themselves, particularly Californians. His father as a pioneer coming here to the United States via New York, and kind of that journey that he had and how that shaped him and how he viewed the world. Do you think that as coming in as an Irish American, as an Irish immigrant, which there was definitely not a popularity in Irish in the United States at that time, how that shaped who he was and the newspaper man that he became?
Well, whenever we approach James, we have to part wide ways of legend building. Because again, not to dwell on CK, but CK and Valentine venerated their father, and I use that word venerated with all the religious impact. He could do no wrong. He was a larger than life character. And for my fellow historians who study, Gold Rush California, know this better than I do, that legends spring up around people who made that trek out here. Not to mention that his own granddaughter, Eleanor, wrote a play about him and about his coming here to Sacramento. So there's that. And they spun a lot of myths. The boys spun a lot of myths about the father, all of whom, most of which are easily debunkable. And they were debunked even at the time. But yet they keep getting repeated. They were repeated in the Bee. I bet if they were going to run their typical February issue celebrating the anniversary of the founding of the Bee, they would repeat them again. But be that as it may, James McClatchy came, like many young men came to the West, a single Irish guy, anxious to make money, believing what historians have talked about, this mythology of, there's gold in them thar hills, believing that the pickings were easy, and then discovering that the kind of hard rock mining that was required to extricate the gold out of the mountain was just far too much. So, and that's the story of so many early Sacramentans and so many early people who came to California. If they didn't end up going back home to where they came from, they would settle down here and become citizens, or they would move to San Francisco or other places. So he shares that common identity with them. And with a gift that he has for writing, how and when he acquired it, his early schooling is not all that clear how he did, but apparently he did. And he gets in on the ground floor of this, field of 1,000 flowers, which is called early California journalism. There's so many papers here, so many papers that get going because the cities expand so quickly. The instant cities, Gunter Barth's instant cities, Sacramento is one of them. There's all kinds of people living here and a desire for the print medium. He becomes involved in that, but he's also kind of torn. He gets married to a widow, Charlotte McCormick Feeney, and that's CK's mother and the mother of his children, and he has to decide now what he's going to do to make a living. And so one trajectory he goes after starting in the ground floor of the Sacramento Bee, where he's not the owner, he doesn't found the paper, but
which they often say.
Which he's the founder of that's CK, the great James, and the sons have built a house to their father. That thing that's in the museum. He dabbles in politics, runs for and is elected sheriff, and he makes a lot of money being sheriff, collecting on foreclosures and other opportunities that is presented to him as one of the chief law enforcement officers of the county. Does that until he's defeated. And of course, the story about his defeat is that he was cheated out of it, and they found all the ballots and no doubt he was a popular guy. He had a nickname, Mac. And when he gets married to Charlotte McCormick Feeney, he gets plaudits from the local newspaper and all that sort of stuff. And even here in Sacramento at Christmas time, they put him up on the balcony of that great light show that they run in Old Sac. You know, he's up there with his British brogue, you know. But it's not until the late 1860s that he decides, I'm going to get serious about journalism. He goes back into the Bee, and there he begins gradually, steadily, systematically to buy out his competitors and ultimately leave the majority of the industry to his two sons, CK and Valentine. And they buy out the very last partner, and thereby cementing the McClatchy hold on the Bee. How do I see him? Well, I see him, first of all, I applaud him because he does not leave Sacramento. As so many other people who made a fortune and just hightailed it out of here, he doesn't leave. He stays here. All right. And I think in any retelling of Sacramento history, that is important to note that other wealthy people fled. The big four fled. Others, but he stayed here and invested in the city. Taking CK under his wing, he imbued him with the ideas, for example, of the usefulness of controlling the water here, the irrigation, reclamation of land, these sorts of things. Not very sexy, not very, unless you're a farmer, or someone dependent on that. But he begins to see. The late James McClatchy, his great-grandson, had the same vision too, a valley vision that, this area could become a real garden, and if the water were properly allocated. He kind of pushes that in a direction. And also his love for the river. I mean, to me, this was really kind of what was behind his vehement opposition to hydraulic mining. It was all that silt was flushing into the river bottom of the Sacramento River. He kind of calls attention to it. He goes up and sees this. He watches it happening. He was deeply devoted to making sure that the Sacramento had an adequate economic base. I doubt whether he would have used those words, but preserving the railroad shops and preserving the kind of stability that it brought to the city was a priority to him. He's a short man. I don't know what, if anything, that has to do with his personality or temperament. I'm a short man, so they tell me I have a short man's attitude, which means I'm too pushy. But he also had a passionate love for the Union during the Civil War. Again, that led them to make up stories, his successors to make up stories that he saved the Union, that he singled out a potential treason in San Francisco, and they arrested the person, or at least took him out of office. And all of that's pretty hazy, like a number of other things. But there's a kernel of truth in it. He was a great and passionate defender of Lincoln and of the Union. That too impressed itself on his sons. There was nobody like CK for the godlike Lincoln. Every year he reproduced the Declaration or the Gettysburg Address in some form or another. Lincoln was the godlike, a term most historians associated with Daniel Webster, the godlike Webster. Well, it was the godlike Lincoln. It was an image of Lincoln that we grew up with as school children. And Washington too. So there was a kind of a patriotism. His view of American history was what historians would call filio-pietistic. It was the old-fashioned history. It was George Washington and the cherry tree. It was, the deification of prominent patriotic figures. And for example, someone like Jefferson, who today we see in a different light because of the important question of race and the contradiction between the words of the Declaration of Independence and his own slave. No one would have. And sexism, yeah, Sally Hennings and
his own daughters.
Yeah. So James, important in terms of the consolidation of the Bee, important in terms of his investment in Sacramento, important in terms of the kind of patriotic fervor with which he gives the 4th of July address, I think, in 1876, the big public gathering here in Sacramento.
Let's go back, because I find it interesting. If you look at him during in 1850, because he was part of the squatters' riot.
Yeah.
And he wrote an editorial with I believe it was Placer Times or the Dispatch, I can't remember which, in which he said, if the landowners want to fight, let them fight, and the devil take the hindmost. Let us put all of the fences of the settlers pulled down, and let us put up all the men who pulled them down. Now that's very incendiary.
Mm-hmm.
And he is very much on the side of the squatters, to the point where he gets arrested. But he's a newspaper man at the same time. So, and I know some people say that was his support of the common man, but how do you take that action in 1850? And maybe talk about what the squatters' riot is.
Well, the squatters' riot, I mean, here in Sacramento, there were unclear boundary lines. They didn't quite even know where all of Sutter's Grant was. And so people came, and this was common throughout the West. People just squatted on land. Literally, this is mine, I built it, I'm not going to register a claim with any particular land office or anything. And of course, people who claimed they did own the land and had legal title to it said, no, you're not going to stay there. And this is a larger Western issue, and complicated in part by shifting government policy, which in some instances permitted squatting. If you get in there, you then after you're there a number of times, you can do it. The Homestead Act of 1862 had, you move into an area there, you improve it, and it's yours. Okay, and then there was the Kincaid Act that came in the early 20th century that expanded this. It was essentially a way to get people to move into undesirable areas there. And so some of that's probably going on here, and it certainly is going on here in Sacramento, which is still subject to flooding, still subject to areas of dislocation. James is from Ireland, and the big issue in Ireland is land. What does the British government do when it takes over Ireland? It confiscates and reduces to tenancy large numbers of the Irish people, small little acreage plots, in which it was barely possible to eke out a living. And then when this horrible fungus hit the potatoes, people were starving because they could, even with what little they had, they couldn't grow anything. But they were tenants too, and that tenancy was seen as a form of dependence on wealthy people. James would have come out of that. He was associated with the Land League, and when the small amount of time he lived in New York, the Land League was interested in making sure that land was accessible to all people. He becomes somewhat of a friend of Henry George, who also rails against land monopoly. And so his support for the squatters, to some degree, would be the reflection of a kind of a hot-headed young man. That's why I mentioned how short he was and fiery. Okay, go ahead. Let's if we're going to have a fight, let's do it right now. Let's get it over with. And the other would be a genuine commitment to equality in land ownership, which I think would be resolved more specifically by the sheer abundance of land that there is here in California. And then also, let's make more land available. So he's buying up in areas that are swampy and making sure that the swamps are drained, and irrigation and other things. Look, rather than fighting over these properties, let's just make sure that you've got the economic opportunity reflected in land in other parts of Sacramento County, and also up and down the valley where the family bought all kinds of property. It's funny, that issue with squatters, of course, it comes up all the time, and of course it's cast in the light of, economic justice, which I believe it was. But James moves away from that kind of confrontational. He becomes part of the establishment in Sacramento. He's not the firebrand, not the revolutionary. He is a believer, however, in economic equality. And economic equality in those days meant equal access to land, equal access to an opportunity to use a piece of good land, watered land, that could produce enough to supply a family.
By 1861 and by 62, when the city experienced the worst flooding it's ever had, and the discussions were being made of what they could do after this, the governor had left town. He was in support of raising the streets and increasing the levies. And when he was broke, people said, well, but we can't afford that. Then he said, then you can't afford to be here. So did that totally change that came over a man that was on the side of the squatters at one time, and now he's just basically saying, then you can't afford to be in Sacramento, and you need to go. And a lot of people did. A lot of people said that too, and he was one of them.
And he would be part of that cadre. There were others who said the same thing too, that we cannot. It's interesting, given areas that become uninhabitable, as Sacramento was. It was an instant city, and the famous, I don't know who wrote it, about they didn't look up and see the driftwood at the top of the trees, or listen to the native peoples who were warning them that this isn't always a healthy place to be. It is remarkable to me. I'll use my favorite word, indomitable, that McClatchy and other of this cadre of local business people and others said, no, we're not going to leave. We're not going to relocate to another higher ground. We're going to make the city work where it is. Now, again, what changed James? I guess being in sort of an establishment, being the sheriff, being in charge of law enforcement, being part of, one of the more stable newspapers in the city, and also his family. Valentine's born in 1857, I believe. CK's born in 1858, and then the two girls are born in the 1860s. You've got to be able to provide for them and provide a place for them to live. Although, interestingly, he gets them out of the city in the summer. His love for this, he stays because he's got work to do, but he sends the wife and the kids off to Vallejo, which has got better sea breezes and the like. But yeah, the transition to a more establishment figure is certainly part of the game. But again, it's so difficult to know him, Marcia, because of the myths repeated by the sons and his lionization. I consider him a city founder. Not literally a city, but a city founder, a member of that cadre of middlemen and others that invested and resolved to stay here and make the best of it. But covered in, I think, a little bit too much glory to help us get an accurate reading of his real person, his authentic persona, and to effectively evaluate his impact on the city. The impact on the city was, for the most part, good insofar as we can tell.
But he's part, like many people of the Gold Rush era, that become mythological.
Mm-hmm.
And Sutter, even
Yes.
pre-Gold Rush, but his mythology that's been so much a part in that people don't even know who Sutter was. He's who the myth that's been created for him. And obviously, if you have children that are perpetuating that, which is what James McClatchy did, it's a whole other thing.
Children with a barrel of printer's ink.
Yeah, the power of the pen behind them, unquestionably. So So they idolize their father, then you come to CK. We talked about him a little bit. Like another person who idolized their father was Eleanor.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would go on to run the paper for, was she the longest? Or was CK longer?
CK was from 1883 until 1936.
A long time.
Eleanor took over in 1936 and was until 78, I think. So, do the math.
Yeah, they stayed a long time.
They stayed a long time, and she, she has the honor of being one of the few women editors at that time. A woman, and. Although her personality, her was much more retiring and shy, and she was impeded by her speech difficulties. She was one of America's important women. I think someone that should be included in a history of women in the United States as aspiring to CEO roles, and also in the history of journalism in the United States. I don't think she has received her due.
No, I would agree with that. But she's also someone who didn't aspire to that.
No,
right?
no.
And she was, the things that I've read where she described how her father asked her to come home after her brother had died, and that it was, he tutored her for a short period of time of how to run a paper, and she followed that religiously through that, but also had a strong sense of being a pioneer family, a descendant of an original 49er. So that concept of history, which is, I think, so much a part of who she was, and as you said, she was much more unassuming. She wasn't a force the way her father and grandfather had been.
But she could be cross her, and she have a part of her father, you're out, to quote him who shall not be named, you're fired.
Really?
And she did that to people who had long tenures with the Bee. She is a fascinating woman. Whoever does her biography is going to have a fun time. I think she's really amazing in many ways. I actually saw her. I was a Bee paper boy. And every year they would, it was not a very financially useful situation. I went in the hole delivering the Bee, but every year she'd kind of want to reward the Bee boys, and so we all gathered at the old Bee building there on 21st and Q, and they put us on a bus to San Francisco. We'd get a box lunch, and we'd watch a Cinerama film or something like that. And she came. I remember her there because she was kind of a shy, retiring woman, and she said a few words to us boys. And then, thank you, boys, for helping the paper. It's something. But reading her life, growing up, a lot of illness at the beginning. Apparently, she came close to death's door a couple of times early on. I'm not quite sure what the diseases were. The letters didn't say that. But then growing up somewhat shy and retiring. Her brother Carlos was larger than life. Her older sister Charlotte was much more headstrong. She ran off and eloped to the consternation of the parents. Interesting thing about her is that her godfather was the Bishop of Sacramento, the Catholic Bishop of Sacramento. Her name is Eleanor Grace McClatchy. Grace is the surname of Bishop Thomas Grace, who was the second Roman Catholic Bishop of Sacramento.
But they were Catholic.
They were Catholic, yeah. And Eleanor was probably the last member of the family that was really Catholic. She remotely practiced her faith, but she grew up, and her speech patterns were problematic. CK had to hire a speech coach in San Francisco and others to help her along, and some of the descriptions were they put pebbles in her mouth and the whole bit, but her great opening comes when she's accepted into a women's boarding school in New York, in the Hudson Valley. I forget the name of the place, but It was a beautiful place, an old hotel that had been reworked and was overseen by a legendary headmistress who was at once kind of severe but also very loving and good. And there, Eleanor's speech improved considerably. My theory was that she was away from her parents, who could be a little overbearing and very demanding of her. But there she developed a love for horse riding. She was an accomplished equestrian. She won awards for being on the back of a horse. She comes back to Sacramento and volunteers for work during World War I with the Air Force boys out in Mather. And she meets and marries a ne'er-do-well. They had a beautiful wedding in the backyard of the McClatchy house. You have the pictures here of her wedding, and it was a beautiful, obviously. But the marriage broke up. And
the reports almost sounded like he had been abusive.
Yes, he was abusive to her, and there's one letter here in the collection where he writes and begs forgiveness. I know I haven't been good to you, and so on and so forth. But by that time, both CK and Carlos had intervened and said, no, you're done. We'll pay you to go somewhere, but go far, far away. I think he was from Indiana. Go back to where you came from. Don't bother us. You did not exist. And then she's free to pursue what she really loves, which is the theater. This she gets from her father. CK was the drama critic of the Bee. He wrote a column called The Green Room, and went to plays and began to experiment with movies. He didn't like movies all that much in the 1920s, but he knew all the important dramatists and actors on the stage in America. He would go back to New York, for example, to the home of Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, and there, his apartment in Gramercy Park was still kind of a museum. He'd go in there and touch the things and channel, because he had seen Booth play Hamlet here in Sacramento, and he had other people who he had attached himself to in terms of their fame on the stage. She must have been bitten by that bug and her father's own passion for these things, and so she goes down to that famous Pasadena Playhouse, and she starts to work. I doubt whether she did any acting because of her speech impediment, but to understand the art and culture of the stage. And she writes this famous play, not so famous, about the dolphin, the ship that comes up here with her grandfather and the like. The letter that she writes, or that is her father writes to her after Carlos has died and after it's clear to him that he's not going to make it, is very sad. You have to do this. I don't have anyone else to turn to. And
not the older sister?
No, she eloped and really kind of distanced herself from the family. It was not a very happy situation. Maloney was her married name, and CK and also Eleanor gave jobs to the boys, of the union, but they had no interest in the paper and didn't want to be bothered. He says, I can't. The only ones I could give it to would be Carlos's kids. That would have been James and CK and Ellery, but they're not old enough. They're hardly teenagers. So she comes back, she writes a letter. It starts, "Dear Chickie," because that's what she called him, Chickie. And, she accepts her fate and goes down. And then he makes sure to surround her with the people in the Bee whom he considers to be the best and the brightest. One, of course, is Walter Jones, who comes into the Bee early on. He's from the Sacramento Star. And Walter Jones is a truly impressive man who if anyone does the Vulcan mind meld with C.K. McClatchy, it's Walter Jones. The two of them are very very close, simpatico. Jones doesn't have to be forced to see the positions that C.K. advocates. So he really becomes the mentor. C.G. Hamilton, who was the financial guy in the Bee. C.G. was a very effective person because there was a great mess, particularly with Carlos's death, and probably some leftover, I'm not quite sure of this, of all the separation from Valentine when the brothers went their separate way and C.K. got complete ownership of the Bee. But Hamilton was one sharp cookie. There, again, his correspondence is here in your shop, and insofar as I'm able to discern these things and make them out, this guy kept things on the straight and narrow and kept the Bee's profits going up. And then a host of other people that she relied on, and Carlos's team in Fresno, which kept the Fresno Bee going in a significant way. And then, she takes over. She moves in, and she begins to encounter some difficulty. She fires C.G. Hamilton. And it really, he aggravated her or second-guessed her. She fires other people, too, that she considers to be disloyal. Has absolutely no use for her uncle, Valentine. They try to, the Valentine side of the family tries to placate her by sending silver service when she gets married, the disastrous marriage. Eleanor sends it back. I don't want anything from you. And then when the Bee gets into the radio, or begins to expand, Carlos had been, but they begin to expand the radio broadcasting. KFB will become KFBK. They got a building and a lobby, and Valentine, still alive, says, I think my portrait should hang there too. No. You're not part of this anymore. And she, snip, you dissed my father and you hurt him very badly. I can't tell you what you did to him and how this distressed him and the things you said. She had a memory for these things.
Was it that bad between the two brothers?
Oh, yeah. It got very ugly in the early 1920s. And it had actually been ugly since 1911. CK had gone off to Europe, and they had mentioned Tom Fox. And it was that while CK was away, that Valentine wrote this savage article about Tom Fox, which upset Ella because he had taken care of her brother. And then CK said, we had discussed this, and we were not going to go after Tom Fox. And you did. And Valentine writes these letters. And then, CK's on a ship, he's sending cables, and Valentine doesn't answer, which drives CK insane. And then finally they get a letter through and all this and that, and they patch things up temporarily. And then the argument sets in about succession. Well, I've got Carlos. Carlos is taking over the paper. No, I've got my sons, Valentine says. I want them to have positions of authority. I'm the co-editor and so on and so forth. And all of this just spirals out of control, especially after the war, especially after Carlos gets home from the war. And he's getting prepped to take over, and they start the Fresno Bee. The Valentine brothers want an editorial board. No way, says CK. No way are we going to be accountable. I'll keep my own counsel, and tries to push Carlos in that direction. It becomes very, very unpleasant, and then finally the two of them have it out. And the things that they say to each other are very hurtful. Very hurtful. Both sides. It uncorks what must have been a long, seething hostility between the two of them. I mean, Valentine, when Valentine and CK take over the paper in the 1880s, CK is having trouble with liquor, and he's got friends who come in and take him to the Golden Eagle and other places, and Valentine gets so aroused that he tells him, either you straighten up or you're out of here. You're not going to. And I said, and what I will also do is criminally or go after legally every one of the servers who goes after you. Any one of these bars that gives you a drink, I'm going to bring them to court for contributing to your delinquency, or words to that effect. And so CK straightens up for a while. He never ever gives up the bottle altogether, but that must have created a layer of tension that, again, is overlaid by work or the demands. Or Valentine was a crack businessman, got a lot of business for the Bee, a lot of ads and advertising. Didn't really interfere all that much in the editorial department, which CK loved, which he prepped for, and which he. But I get the sense that there was a kind of a harmonic convergence between the two brothers. Valentine's one issue that keeps coming. Valentine's a real estate guy, so he's very much involved in. He owns property all over Sacramento and all over the Central Valley. Valentine is very negative about Asian immigration to the United States. Really one of the first great anti-immigration movements of our sometimes xenophobic country. We don't want them in the country. They can't be American. They can't possibly assimilate, so on and so forth. Referring in general to Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, even later Filipinos, and CK is not innocent in this either. He does not share a real positive image of the Japanese in particular. He's not as vitriolic as his brother, but they share this. But Valentine really steps out. He forms an anti-immigration, anti-Japanese immigration league. Its offices are in the Sacramento Bee. When these two separate, one of the first things CK does is kick that office out. You're not using this as your base anymore. But the intensity of the hatred for between the two of them is very real. CK was deeply hurt by his brother. I didn't ever have enough of Valentine's papers to ascertain just how he felt about all this. So that's one thing.
Get them yet.
Yeah, I hope it is, because that side of it, I'll admit, as even the author of this book, is something that really needs, the corrective of his perspective on things and what he saw. And I can see a lot. It's easy to take CK's side because he wins, but it would be interesting to see what Valentine thought and how he believed the paper should be run. And I think his sons did have legitimate reason to believe that they would have an effective and share of the paper. They were nowhere near as talented as Carlos. Carlos was really a genius. But who knows what would have happened as time went on, and who knows if Eleanor's succession would have happened as it did had the two brothers been able to work things out and move another generation of talented McClatchys to the forefront. Valentine made his contributions to Sacramento, to his to real estate, to Joyland.
Whoa!
Sorry about that.
You okay?
Yeah.
Gosh, I gotta moderate my voice.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that was funny.
Thank God it wasn't heavy.
No, I know. They're very light.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Um,
So Eleanor had that anger towards her uncle
very much so.
from that side of the family,
Yeah.
and very loyal to her father.
Extremely loyal to her father and to her father's vision, and again, which she and Walter Jones shared. The Bee was a great paper under her. I mean, it was really kind of, I called CK's the golden era of journalism. I think hers was as well. The Bee was a thick paper. It had international reporting of the highest quality. It had solid editorials. And then, a decent attention to what they used to call the Superior California section, which was all news up and down the valley that you wouldn't get. I mean, I delivered the Bee. I could read about what was happening in Gridley. I didn't know exactly where it was, but I could read about, events, 4-H clubs and things that were happening in Gridley and other places up and down the valley. Her patronage of the local arts is, I'm sure, something that you're going to want to emphasize in the display. And again, clearly this is the flow from her own experience in playwriting, and also the continuation of the interest in the theater that she inherited from her father. She supported the Eaglet Theater. She supported the use of public spaces for the arts. The Bee did not, or the McClatchys did not build the Memorial Auditorium, but were willing to use it as a venue, the big barn they called it. But so many Sacramentans, thanks to Eleanor McClatchy, were able to see things of great cultural value here in Sacramento, and indirectly to lead to the establishment and now the expansion of the community center. These are all things that would have found her blessing. And then above all, the music circus, which opens in the early 50s, which is something very much missed this summer by hundreds of us around the city who saw this as it's the last of those circular theaters that's left in America. They were all over the place. I think they began in New Jersey, and Sacramento is the only one that left, or that was left, and I hope they can survive. Her interest in collection of ancient or early California manuscripts, which you have here in the Center for Sacramento History, is going to be of immeasurable value. It has already been to historians. Her interest in the history of books, another interest, collectors' good fortune that will redound to the well-being of Sacramento. Her interest in the preservation of old Sacramento, such as it was. Again, the links between this place and the preservation of that part of Sacramento, which is still a popular place to go. Mm-hmm. Still, attracts people, diners, and the curious. I think the big anchor of it, you may disagree, is the Railroad Museum, but the efforts of the Sacramento Museum and other venues there, and you can also buy fudge and T-shirts there too. I really appreciated her role there in affecting the urban redevelopment directions of the city. And again, I've studied this a lot around the country and seen, where I live in Milwaukee, I've seen it in Chicago, I've seen it in most major cities of the Midwest, with how these freeways just came in, knocked out all kinds of things, resculpted the city, created zones of prosperity, zones of blight, that she stepped in and said, well, wait a minute, because this had been in progress since the 1950s. Wait a minute, we can do this another way. We can do this another way. I think to the extent that she helped to preserve that early part of Sacramento, I think helped people, like later the tearing down of the Alhambra would mobilize people to say, wait a minute, this is our space, and we can have progress, but we can orient that progress in a way that doesn't mangle or destroy or deface our city. I applaud her leadership for that. She also had a funny relationship with a Bee artist by the name of Dunbar Beck. Dunbar Beck was a single man that lived. She was like her official escort. He went places with. I don't understand much about Dunbar except what I've heard an urban legend here, and I don't want to repeat it. But he was an artist in his own right. he helped to do the decoration in the new Bee building in the 1950s. And he also helped to guide her in the few memorials to the McClatchys around the country. One thing that Dunbar Beck did was a series of Stations of the Cross, which were in the old Stanford Mansion, which was a daycare facility. And I've seen pictures of them. I always wondered what happened to them. But they were very nice pictures of, you know, the procession of Jesus from his condemnation to his crucifixion. He did all that. She also contributed to the decoration of the Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament. When her mother died, her mother was a faithful parishioner at the cathedral. And they bought for the cathedral a new altar and new wall decoration by a very renowned Spanish artist. That all is taken down now because of the renovation of the cathedral. But that was the McClatchy donation there. And then at St. Rose Church on Franklin Boulevard, when Carlos died in the early 30s, they commissioned a series of windows in the little church there, which was really the orphanage of the chapel of an orphanage, that are all dedicated to the McClatchys. Other than the relief of her in the courtyard of the pavilion where the music circus is, I've never seen any other monument to her. C.K. McClatchy, of course, is venerated in the name of the high school, but there's no statue of him, none of those sorts of things. Those are the monuments, and I understand that, and maybe sometime that will, you know, when the city's history comes around to recognizing some of its giants and memorializing them, albeit somewhat in statues, something that we are very problematic today. You know, her contributions to the city and to its well-being reflected the continuity of the McClatchy investment in the city. We live here. We did not leave. Yes, we traveled far and wide. We did all kinds of things, but our love is for Sacramento, and this kind of shoots through the history of the city. Eleanor was quite a woman. She has a mixed reaction among people. Her firing of certain people rankled for many, many years. I found a few that she fired, but that's understandable. No, who wants to be fired?
Well, and I wonder how much of it is that a woman fired them too.
Yeah, that's a very distinct possibility, and especially a woman that seemed so. I don't want to use the word mousy, but I mean she was a retiring. I mean she
almost timid.
Yeah, you wouldn't think, and yet she had that common touch. She would go down to the cafeteria with the bee workers. That's something CK would never do. You know, her father would never do, remote and austere and forbidding in some ways. But she would go down, and people apprecited. Oh, Miss McClatchy sat with us today. And it must have been, again, her stutter never left her, as I understand. Speaking with the fellow who knew her the best at the end, Charlie Duncan, who worked here at the center for a while. Charlie said, Charlie told me that the stutter really never left her. And my mind just goes back to that image of her standing on that platform talking to all of us B-boys. Thank you for helping the Sacramento Bee. Thank you so much.
I know Jim Henley told me when I started here, because he was talking about Eleanor as a collector, and you know, and I think Eleanor, when we talk about old Sacramento, she was instrumental in reaching out to JFK and all of that to help preserve that district, that area. But as a collector, he described that she would be there in this room where they were bidding on things and everyone ignored her. She was so unassuming. And he said she would walk out with the most prized possessions in the group, and everybody would be like, who was that woman? But, you know, to me, her looking at the collection that's here, which is phenomenal, and what she recognized and collected, and that was real of historical value. I mean, some of the materials from the California Gold Rush were just beginning to be valuable when she started to collect them. And that recognition of the significance of California history is what was lost, and very, very few people understood that at that time. And the people who collected like her were documenting something that a lot of other people were missing. And so that to me is quite amazing. She had a lot of people advising her. I've seen the letters of different people saying, we really think you would like this, you should go for this because it has this value. But every time we go back into the collection, we find something that we didn't, it's like we found a portrait of Sutter where he had signed it himself and didn't know it was there because people neglected to write that he'd actually signed it. But the appraiser had described it and that it was actually Sutter's signature. So that in itself, this unassuming woman who fired people, ran a major newspaper for how many years, helped it expand. I believe she started the retirement program there as well. So, and she doesn't get much recognition at all.
And she deserves it.
She does.
She really, again, and McClatchy's stayed here. They invested in this city. They didn't run, they didn't separate themselves, into some remote mansion somewhere in a much more scenic area of the country. They stayed here, and they weren't perfect people, but who was? But their contribution to the well-being of this community is significant, historically significant. We have certain things we've developed in a certain way because of them. They provided an early narrative for the city. I mean, newspapers are the first draft of history. I relied a lot on newspapers to get this information. It's not the only narrative, but it's an important one. But they believed in the city, they believed in its potential and its well-being. They lamented anything that took the city down. Eleanor didn't quite have that, but one way if you would want to incite the ire of C.K. McClatchy was to criticize Sacramento. This included, not only legislators who were forced to come here because of the infrequence of the state government, but also ministers. I mean, he monitored all that. Somebody, this is Sin City, the common palaver of ministers and priests that, this is the worst place in the world to live. We've never had it any, nonsense. And he would go after them and say, no, if you don't like it here, nothing. There's 5 trains leaving every day for San Francisco. He said that to the legislators. 5 trains every day. You can get on any one of them. But that kind of passionate defense of the city and it's the efforts not only successful to move Sacramento beyond this perpetual inferiority complex. We're not, we're located between Lake Tahoe and San Francisco. We're just the flyover zone between those two places you really want to be. Is at least what they tried to overcome.